He even went as far as locking up the bathing soap and toothpaste in their home, forcing his wife Alero to bath with washing detergent and brush her teeth with salt. This was a horrifying time for Alero, who lived like a pauper in her own husband's home, constantly reminded of the fact that her family were poor and wretched. He would say to her that he would never have married her if he knew how wealthy he was destined to become. Once upon a time, there lived a woman who got married to her brother's friend. Her name was Alero, and she fell deeply in love with her brother's closest friend Adeshino. Adeshino and her brother Adili met at a construction site a few years ago and have remained friends ever since. They were poor bricklayers who did menial jobs around the village to survive. One day, whilst they were working at the site, Alero came to the site to drop off her brother's food. Adeshino could not keep his eyes off her. He admired her greatly and decided within himself to marry her. Adeshino then spoke to his friend Dele about his decision to marry Alero, and Dele did not entertain the idea. He could not withstand the thought of his friend and his sister together, so he told Adeshino to keep his distance from his sister. However, Adeshino could not keep his mind off Alero. He decided to secretly approach her to confess his feelings for her, and Alero soon developed feelings for him. As time went on, their bond began to grow stronger, and Dele could not help but notice how close his sister was to Adeshino. He warned her to stay away from his friend, but Alero found it difficult as she was already deeply in love with him. Alero decided to speak to Adeshino, who proposed to her on the spot. She stood there frozen as she could not believe her eyes. She accepted to be his wife, and when the news of their proposal reached the ears of her brother Dele, he called her aside and told her to rescind on her decision to marry Adeshino. But Alero told her brother that she was deeply in love with him. Dele then decided to pay Adeshino a visit to warn him to keep away from his sister, but Adeshino was not willing to do so. He told Dele that he was genuinely in love with Alero and pleaded for Dele to allow him marry his sister. Dele, seeing the seriousness in his friend's eyes, warned him never to hurt his sister because if he ever did, he will make sure that he deals with him. Adeshino promised to be good to Alero, and they got married shortly afterwards. They were so in love with each other and spent most of their time together. However, as weeks turned into months and months into years, Alero was confronted by her husband's true colors. She never knew how heartless her husband was until he began to make so much money from his business dealings. As Adeshino's business flourished, he became increasingly focused on accumulating wealth. Unfortunately, his success brought about a change in his character. He became stingy and controlling, especially towards his wife Alero. He accused her of being wasteful and ungrateful, withholding money and support from her. Alero lived like a beggar in her own home, as her husband not only withheld money from her, he also began to lock up food and other household items in his room, leaving his wife to starve. He even went as far as locking up the bathing soap and toothpaste in their home, forcing his wife Alero to bath with washing detergent and brush her teeth with salt. This was a horrifying time for Alero, who lived like a pauper in her own husband's home, constantly reminded of the fact that her family were poor and wretched. He would say to her that he would never have married her if he knew how wealthy he was destined to become. Adeshino hated his wife for no just cause. Even when she was pregnant for their first child, Adeshino had no compassion for her. He continued to lock up all the food items in the house, forcing her to move from house to house begging for food. She was the topic of discussion among their neighbors, who could not understand why a woman whose husband was so rich would move from house to beg. They called her greedy and refused to give her food because they knew how generous her husband was to those around. Alero stayed hungry for days, drinking only water. Her husband would return home late at night after eating out and doze off without considering the fact that his wife, who was heavily pregnant, had not eaten. One morning, whilst Alero was moving from one house to the other, begging for food, she collapsed to the ground and was rushed to the village healer, who informed her that she had lost her pregnancy. Alera remained in the healer's hut for days, and her husband never cared to come around. A few days later, she returned home to meet her husband's younger sister, Fumilayo, who was eating a huge plate of rice in her home. Alera was in complete shock as she could not remember the last time that she ate some food in her own home. She dashed into the kitchen to prepare some food for herself when her husband's sister walked into the kitchen and poured her food away, warning her never to touch anything in her brother's house again without her permission. She revealed that her brother put her in charge of the entire house and that Alero must seek her permission before touching anything in the house. Alero stood there frozen as she watched her sister-in-law talk to her like a child. She returned to her room and wept and wondered what she had ever done to her husband to warrant such humiliation from him. She waited for him to return and pleaded with him to forgive her if she had ever done anything wrong to him, and Adeshina looked her in the eyes and said that he had more important things to worry about and that if Alero was so unhappy in his home, she could as well leave for her own sanity. Alero cried herself to sleep and woke up the next morning to realize that her husband's sister Fumilayo had invited a friend to come live with them in their home. Alero watched in disbelief as her husband Adeshina welcomed her sister's friend with open arms. This stranger now roamed freely in Alero's house, taking liberties that Alero herself was denied. She acted as if she owned the place, and it wasn't long before she started disrespecting Alero too in her home. Alero lived a life of misery. The constant humiliation, lack of food, and emotional abuse she suffered were now becoming unbearable for her. She lived like a stranger in her own home, constantly being insulted by Fumilayo and her friend Doyin, who began to spend more time with her husband Adeshina. One day, Alero walked in on her husband in a compromising position with her sister's friend Doyin. She confronted them, and Adeshina, instead of feeling remorseful for his actions, beat Alero up in front of Doyin, calling her jealous. He said to her that Doyin was the woman that she could never be, even if she tried, and that he regretted ever marrying such a poor and local woman who was not befitting of his person. Alero stood there and watched as her husband professed his love for Doyin in her presence. The pain was so unbearable as Alero packed up her bags and left his home. She could not believe how much she had endured just to remain married to a man who cared less about her. She returned to her brother, who was so shocked to see how emaciated she looked. What happened? He asked Alero, who burst out in tears and began to cry. Alero told her brother all that had been happening, how she lost her pregnancy because of starvation and how Adeshina beat her up and humiliated her in front of another woman. Dele was so furious to hear this. He could not believe that Adeshina did these terrible things to his only sister. After his stern warning, he confronted Adeshina, demanding an explanation for his sister's mistreatment. Instead of showing remorse, Adeshina called a thug to beat Dele up, leaving him scarred and injured. He then warned Dele to never come close to him again because they were not of the same class. He called him so many condescending names, and Dele could not believe that he was once friends with such a vile and wicked man. He returned home and comforted his sister, who gradually healed from the trauma. Adeshina went on to marry Doyin, who he showed off to the entire village. She was the kind of woman that he always envisioned himself with, a woman who dressed sophisticatedly, who he could take in front of his rich friends without any worries. Additional spent his money on her and bought her everything that she ever needed. His sister Fumilayo was so delighted to see her friend and her brother together. They often talked about Alero and how she was such a terrible fit for Additional, who they both agreed deserved better. One day, this was several months later, Additional's world began to crumble before his eyes. The man, who he trusted with all his money to supply some goods to his business partners, ran away with his entire money, leaving him penniless. Additional searched the entire place for them, but the men were nowhere to be found. He began to struggle with his business and was unable to fulfill the orders, creating a big problem between his business partners and himself. Desperate to save his business, Additional sought the help of his wealthy friends, who turned their backs on him and mocked him. His wife Doyin continued with her incessant demands, not caring about all that he was passing through. She began to nag at every given opportunity, calling him a useless man for being unable to provide her needs. As the months went by, things became worse for Additional, who sold his mansion and began to live in his old hut. His wife Doyin, unable to withstand the suffering, abandoned him and moved on with her life, leaving him alone with his sister Fumilayo. Additional could not believe how quickly things had changed. He decided to visit a powerful seer to seek answers, and the seer revealed to him that he was the author of his misfortune. The seer said that Alera was his good luck charm. She told him that her pure heart and kind spirit attracted prosperity to Additional's life. However, his evil actions pushed her out of his house as she took her blessings with her, making it impossible for him to prosper. Additional could not believe his ears. The woman, who he treated with so much disdain, turned out to be the same woman behind all the wealth that he had enjoyed, a wealth that he kept away from her, subjecting her to a life of suffering, even when she was the sole reason for his prosperity. Filled with regret and desperation, Additional decided to seek Alero's forgiveness, hoping that he might somehow restore his fortunes. He arrived at Alero's brother's hut, but found no one there. He asked around and was told that Dele and Alero no longer lived in the hut. They had moved to a new home, and Additional was directed to where they now lived. To his astonishment, he arrived at a very beautiful house. He knocked on the door, and a well-dressed man answered. "Can I help you?" The man asked politely, and Additional asked to see Alero. The young man invited him in, and Additional could not believe how beautiful the house was. He walked into the living room and saw Alero sitting gracefully on a chair, looking extremely beautiful and happy. Additional could not believe his eyes, as he had never seen Alero this beautiful in his life. He pleaded for her forgiveness and apologized for how badly he treated her. He told her how his life crumbled before his eyes, and he realized that the people around him were only there because of his money. He told Alero that she was his good luck charm, the one behind all of his successes. He pleaded for her to return back to him, promising never to hurt her again in his life. Everywhere fell silent as Additional looked eagerly at Alero and hoped for a positive response. He felt a tap on his shoulder and saw Alero's brother Dele, who asked him what he was doing in their home. Additional apologized to Dele and asked him to plead with his sister Alero on his behalf, and Dele informed Additional that his sister was already married to the gentleman that opened the door for him a while ago. Additional could not believe his ears. He looked at Alero, who informed him that she forgave him a long time ago, not for his sake, but for hers. Alero's husband Tife then spoke up and advised Additional never to come close to his wife again. He walked him out of their home, and Additional was so full of regret. He could not believe how he lost a good woman because of his foolishness and stupidity. He lived all his life, regretting the decisions he made, as he never got to be wealthy again. Alero, however, lived a happy life with her husband, who loved her with all of his heart. They continued to prosper and soon became one of the richest families in the entire village. The lesson to be learned from this story is that the grass is not always greener on the other side. Never despise the days of humble beginnings and do not let money control you. Treat people kindly, no matter the situation you find yourself, as you never know what the future holds. I hope you enjoyed the story.
Like, subscribe, and leave a comment. It helps us grow our channel. I'll see you in our next story. Bye.